My name is Yolanda Chávez Leyva, and I was born in Juarez and raised in El Paso. I was born in 1956, so I'm about to turn 63 years old. I've lived half my life in El Paso. I also lived in Austin for many years. I lived in San Antonio. I lived in Tucson. And I always kept coming back to El Paso. So I finally decided just to come back to El Paso for good. My family's from Chihuahua. My mother, who raised me, was born in Chihuahua, in 1912, and my father was born somewhere in Durango or Chihuahua in 1910. They were my adoptive parents. My biological mother gave me to her great aunt and uncle when I was born. When I was born in Juarez in the mid-50s, my biological mother was very young, not married. I just recently found out who my biological father was. And she, I guess, didn't know how she would be able to raise twins. When we were born, we were just 2 pounds each, and we had a lot of medical needs. So she gave us to her great aunt. No, I'm sorry. She gave us to my great aunt and my great uncle who adopted me. And she gave my sister to my grandmother, and my sister died pretty quickly in Juarez because she didn't have medical care. So when I say my mom and daddy, I'm thinking about my adoptive parents. So I have a lot of memories about food from throughout my whole life. So starting when I was 3, and I would hoard food. So I would hoard vegetables in the drawers, and I'm not really sure because my mother fed me very well. So I don't know, I was, and I think maybe I was born with this fear of not getting enough nutrition because I was so tiny when I was born, 2 pounds, and because I was sharing the womb with my twin sister. So I was hoarding food. So I've always been really aware of the presence of food in my life. When I was growing up, when I was a kid, I always wanted to cook, and I'd always be in the kitchen with my mother. And my mother had a very big reputation as the best cook among her comadres. Everyone wanted her food. And I would tell her, Mama, teach me how to make this, teach me how to make that. And she would always say, no, mija, you're going to cook your whole life. You should just enjoy your life right now. Because she saw housework, she saw cooking, cleaning as something that I would do forever, so why start so early? But what I did is I always watched her. So by the time I was maybe 13, 14, I knew how to cook everything just from having watched her. And I remember she would say, how do you know how to cook that? Like when I would make fideo, and I'd say, because I've been watching you my whole life. So I just observed how she cooked. Although I remember when I was about 5, my mother was very influenced by advertising because this is the 1960s. And because she came here as a young woman to the United States at a time in the 1920s when advertising was really becoming big, like she wanted to do the things that she saw on TV or in magazines earlier. So she ordered a matching apron for her and for me from Betty Crocker. And I always remember those aprons because they were pink and they were checkered, and it came with a little cookbook for kids. So we would both wear little aprons. And then the only thing I remember that we made was a salad. It was called a turtle salad. And of course, in the 1960s, everything is prepared, everything is processed. So we used canned peaches and canned cherries, and we put little cloves for the eyes. So that's the first thing I remember making with my mother. When I was in high school, and because I was in high school in the early 70s, we had home education, home economic classes. And these home economic classes were all about sewing and cooking. So I remember loving to learn to make different things. The one that I loved to make and that my neighbors, until they passed away, reminded me that I even shared with them was eggplant parmesan. So that was pretty fancy for me. Um, you know, I wasn't exposed to a lot of different foods when I was young. When I think back on it, I was 20 years old before I had any pizza. I was 20 years old before I had an artichoke. I was 20 years old before I had shrimp. So those things were very like mysterious and exotic to me. And I had them when I moved to Austin. And I think now how my grandchildren eat, and they have been exposed to many, many different kinds of food. So when I tell them I didn't have pizza till I was 20, they can't even imagine what that was like. When I think about my mother, well, let me tell you the story first. Like 12 years ago, I was in Mexico, in La Ciudad de Mexico, and I was with another scholar, and her suegros lived there. So she said, we're going to go eat with my suegros, and they're from Michoacan. So we got to their house, and her suegra had prepared this elaborate, beautiful meal for us. She was an excellent cook, and she said that it was her honor to prepare a traditional meal for me. And it was things like mushroom soup, things that we don't eat in the north of Mexico or in the southwest of the United States. It was delicious. And I'm sitting there at her table enjoying her food. And then she says, and what are the traditional foods that your mother cooked, Yolanda? And I was under a lot of pressure, like, what did she cook? And the only thing I could think of was meatloaf. And then I didn't know how to say meatloaf in Spanish either. So I was like, but I said meatloaf. So when I think about my mother and her meatloaf, I think about how she grew up. So she comes to the United States in 1921, and she was 9 years old. And she's very influenced by advertising. She's in schools that have Americanization programs. Her only cookbook was this cookbook, the American Woman Cookbook, published in 1944. And it is a cookbook of very traditional American foods. Although she has a little recipe in here from a newspaper, Bizcochos de Vino, so she was also looking for that. So she has this cookbook. I think back in the 20s she was a flapper. So at a time where her very traditional parents wanted her to be a traditional Mexican young lady, she was rebelling. She cut her hair short, she wore red dresses, which is a big escándalo back then. And I can see that she started to cook in an American kind of way. She was very rebellious. She didn't learn how to sew. She didn't learn how to make tamales. She didn't make menudo. She didn't make the things that my friends' mothers made because she wanted to be a modern American. Which is strange to me because when she raised me, I was born when she was in her 40s. She didn't speak any English to me. She was to me, seemed super Mexicana. So to look at this earlier part of her life where she was trying to be very American and it's reflected in her food is very kind of shocking to me to think about that. When I was growing up, she made a delicious meatloaf. Like I wanted to tell the suegra in Mexico, delicious meatloaf. She loved to make potato salad. She loved to make barbecue chicken. But she also made enchiladas, she made chile relleno, she made frijoles. Sometimes she made tortillas. So she would cook also Mexican foods. There were some dishes, and I've looked through this cookbook to see if she got them from here. There were some dishes I really loved, like fried cabbage, and fried cabbage, and she would put weenies in it. So I've looked into like who cooks fried cabbage because I don't know where that came from, and it turns out that it's a very southern dish. And then I remembered that my mother lived in West Virginia for a couple of years with my father, who was in the army, but they lived with an older couple who rented a room in their house. So she also learned to cook from this older West Virginian white lady. So I said, that's where the fried cabbage came from. She even had like this southern influence in her cooking.